Day of our series, and we are here to celebrate the Teachers' Day in the spirit of understanding, acknowledging, and appreciating the pivotal role of teachers in the society. While September 5th marks the birth anniversary of Dr. Radhakrishnan, a teacher and a philosopher, today we celebrate the day more in the spirit of understanding, acknowledging, and appreciating the pivotal role of teachers in the society. While September 5th marks the birth anniversary of Dr. Radhakrishnan, a teacher and a philosopher, today we celebrate the day more in the spirit of understanding, acknowledging, and appreciating the pivotal role of teachers in the society. So today we celebrate the day more in the spirit of the idea of teacherhood, transcending the individual and embracing the universal idea of teaching, where we are remembering, acknowledging, and celebrating the works of each one of us who identifies to be a teacher. The talk series is organized by Center of Excellence in Teacher Education, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. CETE, established in 2015, is an independent center at TISS Mumbai, and it has been working towards revitalizing the education sector through research, academic programs, teaching, field action programs, policy advocacy, partnerships, and collaborations. Today, we are delighted to have Dr. Oliver Liang, who will be presenting the recommendations of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on teaching profession. Dr. Liang is head of the Public and Private Service Unit of the Sectoral Policies Department at the International Labour Organization in Geneva, Switzerland. His team deals with working conditions of service workers, including education workers. Together with UNESCO, he coordinates the Secretariat of the joint ILO and UNESCO Committee of Experts on the Status of Teaching Personnel and promotes standards on education and teachers. In 2023, he coordinated, together with UNESCO and United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on teaching profession. He also works on labor issues related to health, culture, sports sector, as well as sustainable consumption. Dr. Liang previously served as a manager of development cooperation policy at ILO and as a coordinator of the Information Service on International Labor Standards. He holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, United States of America. Today, along with Dr. Liang, we have Ms. Vrinda Sarup, who will be the chair for the session. Ms. Swaroop is a retired Indian Administrative Service Officer with over 35 years of administrative experience. She held various esteemed positions in the Government of India as well as the Government of Uttar Pradesh. She served as a Union Secretary, School Education and Literacy, and in the Government of Uttar Pradesh, she held eminent positions such as Principal Secretary Finance, Principal Secretary Technical and Vocational Education, State Project Director, Education for All Projects. And earlier in her career, she served as District Magistrate across the state. Ms. Swaroop has played a significant role in the planning and implementation of some of the prominent pan-Indian school education programs, including District Primary Education Program, which we famously known as DPEP, and Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan. She collaborated closely with international organizations, including the World Bank, DFID of UK, UNICEF, European Union, and the World Food Programme. With this, I invite Ms. Swaroop to give her opening remark and chair the session. Welcome you both. Welcome you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those kind words. And I join my voice in welcoming Dr. Oliver Liang.
Dr. Vrinda ma'am, we cannot hear you. Perhaps you are muted.
Can you hear me now? Yes? So Oliver is saying yes. So will you guys check or you can't hear?
Please give us a minute. Yes, ma'am. Can you please speak now?
Yeah. Can you hear me now? I think there must be something wrong at the receiving end because I think online, Dr. Liang can hear me. Can anybody else join online? Confirm can hear? Oh, they can
Please
all
give
hear
us a
that.
minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed, I can hear you.
Thank you,
So I
Doc.
wonder, yeah.
I'll just wait for their, otherwise their audience in the room would be.
I would much rather be in Mumbai, but
Yeah.
You need to check it. Speak. Okay. Vrinda ma'am, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Okay. May I request you to please continue?
Okay, thank you. So let me lend my voice also to welcoming Dr. Oliver Liang for being with us today. And we're all.
Ma'am, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay. May I request you to please continue?
Okay, thank you. So welcome to Dr. Liang, and we're all looking forward to hearing from you. Yes. And
may I request you to please continue?
Okay, thank you. So I think there's a repeat going on. I mean, you're saying the same thing.
Welcome
Back
to
to
Dr.
me,
Liang, and
all looking forward to hearing from you.
yes,
It's your recording which is playing back.
May I request
Please.
you to please continue?
Okay, thank you.
it seems that the recording is playing over and over again.
I mean, yes. You're saying, I think you need to set this right.
and
Please switch off your mic. Your recording is playing back over and over again. So it's a very important day for us today, as was mentioned in the opening remarks from CETE, that today for us is the birth anniversary of Dr. Radhakrishnan, who was our president for the country. But more than that, he was revered as a teacher, as a professor, as a guide, as a philosopher friend. And so this is a day which is very sacred in India, because it gives us an opportunity to what we call Guru Naman. Guru Naman is a way of, the Guru, you understand, is the teacher, and the Naman is the respect to that teacher. So this is a day when the country comes together to respect, acknowledge the great work done by teachers and how they've been so fundamental, not only in the spread of education, but also in social development for a young country, which is only now 75 years old, and also in the whole task of nation building. So it's a day which is held in great reverence, and all of us who are presently in school or who have, who are steering their children and grandchildren to the process of learning, everybody sits back today and acknowledges the great gift of the teacher, of the guru. So this is a very appropriate day, and what I could make out from Oliver Liang's biodata was also that this is, a time when we have to look at international experiences. We should look at some ways in which we can improve, leverage up, and improve our teacher education sector so that our teachers move with times. And times, they are changing and changing very fast with the new technologies, new research, which brings in new ideas of pedagogy, inclusion, and this whole boom of IT and how it impacts the classroom and how it impacts teacher development itself. So a great opportunity, and I welcome all of you to this talk series, and we look forward to our speaker today. Over to you, Dr. Liang.
Thank you so much, Madam Sarup, for those kind words. And a real pleasure to be here with you all. Hello, everyone. I wish I could be there personally. It is getting cold and rainy here in Geneva, Switzerland, and I'm sure it's much more agreeable where you are in your prestigious center. Yes, I will talk today about the United Nations Secretary General's high-level panel on the teaching profession, which I had the honor to work with my colleague Carlos Vargas, whom I understand addressed you yesterday. So I think this is a very good pairing of speakers that you've arranged, and I hope that I can complement a little bit about what he spoke about yesterday. Let me just get into my presentation, if you bear with me for a second, and I will start that and just ask for a nod if you can see the slides. Is that visible to everyone?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, very good. Then we can really get into the heart of it. So for those of you, maybe I should introduce myself a little bit more. For perhaps those of you who don't know what the International Labor Organization is, it's a United Nations agency based here in Geneva, Switzerland. It's a fairly old UN agency. It was actually founded back in 1919, when even before the United Nations, when there was the League of Nations. And it is an organization dedicated to labor and labor issues. It's a unique agency in the UN system because it brings together three bodies, or three groups, I should say: governments, who are usually represented by labor ministries, and employers associations, and workers organizations, normally trade unions. So these three constituencies have an equal part in the ILO's governance. The ILO is also a very normative agency. It actually adopts international labor conventions, and we'll get into those a little bit. These are international treaties that are ratifiable and binding on member states regarding a number of labor issues. And the ILO is fairly unique in the UN system because it has a very strong supervisory body that supervises the application of these conventions and looks at how countries implement them. And if there are problems in the implementation, then unions and employers organizations have the ability to provide information to the ILO, to its supervisory bodies, for examination for problems. And so, just for your information, India has ratified 47 of those international labor conventions, including some very important ones on, for example, the abolition of forced labor and the abolition of child labor. But we'll get into that in a little bit. What I want to talk to you about today is a recent United Nations body that was established by the United Nations Secretary General that dealt with the teaching profession. So maybe to explain how this all came about, let me give you some background about where teachers appeared on the international agenda. So more than almost 60 years ago, back in 1966, there were the first movements on the international scene to deal with teachers, because it was agreed that education, and especially teachers, as Madame Sarupa mentioned, were an important part of national development. And you couldn't have national development, especially all these young states that had emerged and freed themselves from colonialism. It was agreed that education was going to be a critical part of developing these countries and reaching social and economic development. And of course, teachers were going to play a big role here. It was also perceived at the time that there was an enormous shortage of qualified teachers in many of these emerging countries. So back in 1966, both UNESCO and the International Labor Organization started looking at what kind of conditions teachers faced. And after a series of technical meetings, they adopted a recommendation called the Recommendation Concerning the Status of Teachers, which to date is still the only international instrument on the teaching profession. Now, this instrument, I have to say, is quite an interesting one, and you can find it on the internet. I can share with you later the website where you could find all these things. It's a fairly long recommendation, and it goes quite into technical detail of a lot of things that deal with the teaching profession. And having examined it many times, it is still quite astounding how the authors of this instrument really captured many, many issues that are still relevant today. In fact, I was surprised just a couple of years ago to find a paragraph on the conditions of work of teachers during epidemics. So the framers of this particular instrument, I think, really were. It was a very thorough and technical job that they did adopting this instrument. So this has become the main instrument that we work with when it comes to teachers. 30 years later, UNESCO, together with the ILO, but as a UNESCO instrument, also adopted a similar instrument concerning the status of higher education teaching personnel in 1997. And this is also a very important instrument dealing with tertiary education, and it really deals with some very critical issues that are very critical today, such as the independence and autonomy of higher education institutions, academic freedom, and governance. And as all of you are sitting in a tertiary institution right now, this is a very relevant instrument to all of you. What's amazing is that these two instruments are legally recommendations. That means they're not conventions. They are not treaties that can be ratified. So countries don't have to sign them, and they are technically not binding on countries. They are really just recommendations, kind of guidance for what countries should and could do with regard to teaching personnel. However, back in 1968, both UNESCO and ILO also decided it was important to have a kind of supervisory mechanism attached to this recommendation. So they established the joint ILO-UNESCO Committee of Experts on the application of the recommendations concerning teaching personnel. And this is a body of 12 experts that meets every 3 years and looks at how countries are applying the two instruments, the one from 1966 and the one from 1997. I should add, obviously, back in 1968, they didn't include the 1997 recommendation. That was included later in a decision by both UNESCO and the governing body. On top of that, not only do they sort of supervise the trends and how countries are applying these recommendations, but they can actually receive complaints by unions and by other groups on how countries are applying these two recommendations. Now, this is very strange because in international systems, it's very rare to find a recommendation that has this kind of supervisory body attached to it. We have similar supervisory bodies, but they only apply to countries that have ratified a convention, which makes sense, right? If you voluntarily sign up to a kind of law, then it would make sense that there are supervisory bodies and complaints mechanism attached to it. But for this recommendation, it was considered so universal in its scope that at the time it was considered that countries really don't even have to ratify this. They should respect it so much that a supervisory body should be attached to it. And it just so happens that the committee of experts will meet again next week here in Geneva. And the colleagues from UNESCO, the gentleman who addressed you yesterday, will be coming with his team, and we will be hosting the meeting of the committee of experts, which will be discussing various issues related to the 66 and 97 recommendations. And they will also be looking at a number of allegations that we've received regarding violations or non-respect of these two recommendations. So a very unique kind of thing in the international system. And then I will finally want to just point out that 10 years ago, the ILO also adopted some guidelines on the promotion of decent work for early childhood education personnel. These are guidelines. They are not quite as strong as a recommendation, but they are also the first international instrument regarding working conditions of this growing body of educators. And certainly the field of early childhood education has become increasingly important and is recognized today as a key element in preparing learners for education and, of course, for national development. So that's a bit the background of where the international system had developed. By the way, the 1966 recommendation that I mentioned was adopted on 5th of October in 1966. 5th of October, as you may know, is the international version of World Teacher Day. It's where many countries celebrate their National Teacher Day. I'm just so happy that India has decided to move it up a month and to combine it both with a celebration of your former president and to acknowledge the importance of teachers on this day. So that's really quite interesting. Now, in recent years, teachers have gotten renewed interest. Back in 2021, the ILO held a technical meeting on the future of work in the education sector. We've also held various international meetings on skills and lifelong learning. And UNESCO, as you've heard yesterday, has done quite a bit of work on the futures of education. And coming out of that, they have also issued just earlier this year a global teacher report, which is based on a lot of research that was done recently. And I think coming from these recent studies in the last few years, it has become clear, as Madam Sarup mentioned at the beginning, that really things have changed since 1966. There are many new challenges, many new issues facing the teaching profession today, and education in general. And in light of that, in 2022, Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, convened a Transforming Education Summit in New York. And the idea was to bring together the world and to really, for once and all, examine what the new issues were in education, especially as the world scrambled to meet the targets of Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is dedicated to quality education for all. So this large international summit featured several tracks, and one of the tracks was on teachers and teaching, which was convened by the ILO and UNESCO together, together with the governments of Romania and Nigeria. And it brought together numerous international consultations on teachers. The Transforming Education Summit, like all big international summits, was a big international meeting, and it led to some, I think, important breakthroughs. Certainly on financing for education, there was the establishment of a financing facility for education for financing for education, led by the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown. There was the launching of a large initiative drawing on existing initiatives on providing greater digital tools in the education sphere. And there was certainly some work on education of girls and the integration of sustainability and environmental sustainability in education, sort of the greening of education agenda. But on teachers, strangely enough, there, besides a lot of pretty words about how important teachers are, there wasn't really a breakthrough moment. And this is maybe where the ILO and its constituents played an important role. The teacher unions of the world, led by Education International, lodged a very strong protest to the Office of the Secretary General and threatened even to not endorse the outcome of the summit, which would have been, I think, a fairly serious turning of events. I mean, if the very people who are responsible for delivering education around the world are not on board with what the world is saying should be the educational goals, that's not really going to look very good. And the Secretary General in his office listened, and they said, look, they fully saw the problem. And as a result, he established this high-level panel on the teaching profession, which was aimed at bringing together high-level experts under high-level leadership to look at what the current situation is of teachers and make some recommendations. And so together with UNESCO, we formed the secretariat of this panel. It was ultimately led by two former heads of state, the former president of Estonia and the former president of Trinidad and Tobago, two very powerful women. And it brought together 18 experts, ranging from several ministers of education to a minister of labor, to various academic experts, representatives of teacher unions, representatives of employers' organizations, a representative of youth organizations, and various other stakeholders and NGOs. And for a number of months, through many, many virtual consultations, they developed recommendations regarding new pathways for teachers that could be taken up by the international community. Now, let me get into a little bit what they saw. Coming out of the Transforming Education Summit, I mean, what was clear was that the shortage of teachers problem has not gone away. And as I'm sure Mr. Vargas yesterday pointed out, 44 million additional primary and secondary teachers are still needed globally to achieve the SDG goals by 2030. And this is something that we see in many sub-Saharan African countries, but it's just as visible next door here in France and in the United Kingdom. Many of these teachers are required at the secondary level and are important because they have to replace the high attrition rate that we see in the teaching profession. And this, of course, is a really serious issue and problem facing countries if they want to achieve the quality education goals. It's estimated that only 78 out of 197 countries will achieve the required quantity of teachers to, for example, ensure universal primary education. And there's a gendered element here. It tends to be men teachers that leave the profession early. And many teachers, for example, leave the profession in the first 5 years. So stemming this attrition rate and finding teachers to reach these goals is really important. And as we'll get into later, a lot of the reason for this attrition is linked to things like working conditions and the relative difficulty of competing, at least with salaries and other conditions, to other jobs in other sectors. A second area that was identified by the Transforming Education Summit was the problem of quality of teachers. It's estimated that around 85% of secondary teachers globally today have the minimum required qualifications. So overall, that's growing in the past 10 years. But in areas like sub-Saharan Africa, for example, you might only have 60% of teachers that actually have the qualification to teach, yet they are in the classroom. And on top of that, we have to add that you have, for example, very high pupil to train teacher ratios in some countries. In developed countries, the average might be 15 pupils to one teacher. But once you get into developing countries, you might have figures up to 52 pupils per trained teacher. That was an average back in 2022 in some developing countries. And certainly that can highly degrade the quality of teaching that the learners are receiving. Salaries is another big issue affecting the quality of teachers. In a number of developing countries, they are competitively there are competitive salaries, but at least in half of all countries that were examined, the pay for primary teachers was less than other professions requiring similar qualifications, and this decreases just to 3 in 10 countries in Europe, in Europe and Northern America. So in the developed world, they tend to be somewhat better paid. Salary, of course, is an important issue as well in retention. And then finally, and what I thought was interesting coming out of the UN Secretary General's initiative on this, was this problem of the relevance of teachers. Or I should say, of teaching and education in general. And that is what is being taught today and is what education is giving to learners today still relevant, and is it something that is going to be attractive for learners, for parents to invest in, and to, I guess, give them the status still of guru, as was pointed out in the introduction, which I think is so important. The ILO estimates that there's a global shortage of around 40 million highly skilled workers, and so that there is clearly still a need for further education to get people into the workplace. A number of years ago, a survey pointed out that 40% of employers actually thought lack of skills was the main reason for not filling entry-level jobs, and that 60% of new graduates, and here by that I mean tertiary graduates, were not adequately prepared for current work. So what they were learning was not really preparing them for the work that was going to be executed in the labor market. So that is really, one indication that even where their education is available, it might not be what the labor market is requiring or what is necessary to succeed, at least in the work part of life. And that's, of course, only in situations where education is available. In many countries, there is still a lack of education for many children. Over half of children today do not have any kind of pre-primary education. As you probably know, the World Bank has found that up to 70% of children in poorer countries are unable to read a basic text by the age of 10. That means they can read, technically, but reading comprehension is so poor that simple content comprehension remains deeply underdeveloped. And that nearly half of students don't complete secondary schools. And you still have around 700 million adults that are illiterate, which, of course, in a highly advanced world undergoing a fourth industrial revolution, this is really going to leave many, many people behind. So there is really a crisis in education. Now, drawing on that, both the ILO and UNESCO have also examined some other challenges facing teachers. Teachers today are no longer only responsible for their subject matters. It used to be enough to be able to teach biology or mathematics or English or French. Today, teachers are responsible for so many more other areas, including peace and global citizenship, health education, entrepreneurship education, community building. Many schools are now integrating climate change into their curricula, so that becomes an important area that teachers have to be knowledgeable about. Well-being of both students and of teachers, and issues of social justice and peace. These are really new challenges that teachers are facing in addressing in their curricula. Of course, you know better than I do that new pedagogies and technologies are popping up. There is a greater emphasis now on holistic and experience-based teaching that is practically relevant for students. So team learning, learning that is linked to that cross links with various subjects and is interdisciplinary. Teachers no longer are simply content deliverers, but they are becoming, there's a greater expectation for them to be guides and leaders in the vast sea of information that is now available to students that have access to digital content. They have to be innovators, really, in how to use new technologies. Teachers are facing, if not not only a question of having access to good information sources and teaching materials, but they are facing the opposite, a lot of bad teaching materials and bad information coming through social media. So the promise of the internet, which promised to link all learners to the best minds of the world, has also linked, unfortunately, learners to the worst minds of the world. And so teachers now become this very critical guide, this very critical guru that has to guide students through this vast sea of information and bring them to information that is really useful and correct. And finally, artificial intelligence is, I think, really going to exacerbate this further, because now the creation of simply absolutely fictitious content is so much more easy, fictitious evidence. And so there was a big emphasis on making sure that teachers became creative users of technology and not just passive consumers. And then I think I've mentioned some of this before. There are contextually around teachers greater social challenges. Migration, international migration is much more intense today than it was 60 years ago. In many countries, teachers will have classrooms filled with migrants, but also with refugees and learners that are traumatized from crisis situations, be it war, be it natural disaster, be it internal conflict. Mental well-being is a crisis, at least here in Western countries. Young people, I think, have hit record levels of depression, record levels of anxiety, the exact causes of which are not clear, but research indicates that it has a link to use of social media, and to some degree, the increased pressure that we face in education, which has become very focused on high stakes testing and very competitive um, exam performance in academic contexts. And there is the issue of climate change, which will, of course, impact education as well, not only heat in buildings, but trying to manage the learning that is required to deal with climate change, but also the mental well-being that needs to go along, accompany teaching on climate change. It's no good to confront primary students with lectures on how the world is doomed. We have to give them hope, and the idea of a pedagogy of hope was raised several times. And finally, the pervading inequality that faces the world is a context in which educators have to operate again today as well. It is not unlikely that teachers will face either students that are too poor to eat in the morning, too poor to afford school fees, too poor to afford material for performance at school. And in some countries, they will face students that are so wealthy that they can, will drive up to school in a car that's worth 10 times a teacher's salary. So these kinds of inequalities face educators as well. So after facing all these, after looking at all these very new challenges in facing the teaching profession, the high-level panel tried to come up with some recommendations on what the world could do to improve the situation and really re-elevate the status of teachers. Now, a lot of what the high-level panel came up with is not particularly new. It's stuff that was already in the 1966 recommendation. But I think they did a very good job of taking that as a basis and then looking at how to take it a step further and what is really some of the best practices and some of the new ideas that are coming out of international literature and practice that could elevate the status of teachers, make it a profession that the best and the brightest would go into, and make it one where people would stay motivated, where people would stay in as a career profession rather than leave it after a few years in frustration. So some of the elements that came out of here was the importance of a teacher's career, beginning with things like induction and mentorship. It's fully understood that teaching is not something that can be simply learned, even at very excellent centers like yourselves, in theory. It is something that has to be practiced, of course, during the training, but even years after the end of formal training, it is understood that there are several years where teachers are going to have to practice this technical art and be mentored and supported by people with more experience. So having an induction for teachers and pairing them with experienced mentors that can accompany them through the first 4 or 5 years of their career would be an important step. It was said many, many times that teaching can be a lonely profession, and many teachers complained, and even some of the teachers that were on the panel complained, that it is a career that's marked being dropped in the deep end of the pool with a classroom of learners and very little support. And one of the key practices that has been identified as helping in that is establishing teacher networks and teachers' communities of practice so that teachers can collaboratively share experiences, share tips and tricks on how they're handling situations, how they are dealing with particular learning challenges. And that is something that is highly recommended and encouraged by the high-level panel as well. The panel put a great emphasis on formative assessment. In other words, it is important for quality control of teachers, for them to be assessed and evaluated, but that should really be with the focus of providing constructive feedback. It was important to build further partnerships with education institutions, such as the one you are at currently, to make sure that schools have partners in the academic world, to continue the loop of research and theory to be paired with experience and practice. There was a great emphasis on open digital resources, and I could get into that a lot further. While education technology has created many wonders, it has also created many challenges for schools and for teachers. We saw that especially during COVID. Um, Private companies were very eager to share their technology with schools, but at that point, schools lose some of their independence. They become highly dependent on corporations for technological platforms. The content is no longer controlled by teachers or by schools. It's controlled by large conglomerates, many of them situated in the West. And suddenly licenses and fees become oppressive, and the whole digital infrastructure for schools becomes unsustainable. And this all the more so in developing countries where even access to electricity, for example, for schools can be a problem. So making sure that digital resources are open, digital resources have sustainable procurement and maintenance plans really became an important issue. And finally, there was also an interest in strengthening partnerships with the private sector, especially bridging that gap between learning and the practical skills that are needed for the labor market. Now, what I also found interesting from the panel's recommendations, and again, I will share a website where you can find all these recommendations, was three things. One was a focus on the enabling environment for education. As you probably know, one of the narratives that has emerged on teachers, perhaps well-intentioned, but somewhat destructive, is this idea of the teacher as Superman or Superwoman, as this absolutely selfless, dedicated person who deals with children or learners and deals with all sorts of adversity, if they are poor, if they have social problems, if they are drug addicted, if they have mental issues, and that the teacher can solve all these problems. That is simply a narrative that is not going to encourage a lot of people to go into the profession. With all due respect, teachers are extraordinary individuals. They're a very important profession, but they are workers like everyone else who should have a certain limit and to the scope of what they are responsible for. And so this panel, I think, made a very important emphasis on the importance of an enabling environment for education. You have to have the financing for education so that the infrastructure and the salaries are correct. You have to have a society that invests in the social environment around education. If children don't have housing, if they don't have food, if they don't have physical security, you cannot expect schools and teachers to make up for that simply. So that whole of government and whole of society approach needs to be taken to ensure the well-being of learners. Parents have to be supported. It is uncontestable that parents and the home environment play an important role in how especially children are going to learn. And if our economy dictates that two wage earners have to leave the house at 6 in the morning and come home at 8 in the evening to fulfill jobs and to maintain them and to maintain basic housing and food, then it is going to be very difficult for schools to play that in loco parentis role of encouraging homework, of encouraging learning. So we need a work environment and work-life balance where parents and family can also support the learning process. The second interesting thing I think the panel emphasized was this idea of multiple paths towards life success. And this addresses a little bit this question of high stakes learning and high stakes testing that at least marks some education cultures. The panel recognized that the job of teachers is not to get students into top universities. That could be part of their job, but it's rather to make sure that people have success in life. And that success in life can take many forms. It does not necessarily mean admission to a prestigious university and a tertiary degree as an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer. With all due respect to those professions, we have many, many of those. It is just as important to have excellent bakers, plumbers, electricians, street cleaners, etc. And making sure that the entire education project gears toward producing excellent human beings rather than top graduates, I think will have a big impact also on how we measure teacher success. And finally, the panel mentioned decent working conditions, of course, as being the bedrock of addressing the teacher shortage, but also ensuring that teaching remains an attractive profession and one that retains people who are highly qualified and highly motivated. And since I'm from the ILO, I'll spend just a few minutes, the last few minutes of this presentation, going a little bit deeper into what that means. What do we mean by decent work for teachers? So I would say that from the ILO's perspective, it focuses on 5 major areas. The first one, and I'll get into this one a little bit deeper, is the fundamental right of freedom of association and the effective right of collective bargaining. What we mean by that is that teachers, like all workers, should have the right to form associations or unions to defend their interests. And in doing so, they should be able to, if the other party agrees, engage in negotiation about their working conditions. Now, this seems very obvious, and it's good to know that in India there are a number of strong teacher unions. But in many countries, for example, there are no teacher unions, or teachers are forbidden to unionize, or if they unionize, they are not allowed really to negotiate on many topics. And in a number of countries where there are violations of freedom of association, it tends to be teacher unions that are the victims. We've even had cases of teachers' union leaders being killed or arrested in some countries that are cracking down on unions. So this question of freedom of association is still a critical one for the teaching profession around the world. On collective bargaining, it's a little bit narrower. There are, of course, areas where collective bargaining is often the main way of dealing with issues. For example, in Europe, collective bargaining tends to happen on teacher salaries. But other forms of social dialogue, such as consultation or information sharing, are also highly encouraged. And I'll get into that a little bit later on wider aspects of education policy. Wages, we already mentioned. The ILO considers that wages should be comparable, if not higher, to other similarly qualified professions. In other words, professions that require a similar level of qualifications and practice. And that's still an area where a number of countries have to invest further. Now, it's a challenge because wages are the biggest bill for any education ministry. Teacher wages are going to take up something like 70 to 75% of the education budget. So there's not a lot of wiggle room in a lot of countries to increase teacher salaries, and especially in countries that are growing and countries that need to expand the teaching workforce. But it's very much the opinion of the high-level panel that teaching is not an expenditure, it's an investment. It's something that governments can easily justify spending on because the returns on good teaching are going to be much higher than the actual investment. There is still a challenge of raising internal revenue for education, and I think that's one where the Transforming Education Summit was also quite strong on looking at ways to increase internal revenue, especially cracking down on, for example, tax loopholes and corruption, which are really bleeding a lot of countries from this revenue that could be invested in things like teacher wages. Work-life balance, which I mentioned before, is an issue that faces many teachers as well. Teachers tend to be a young profession, especially coming in. Professionals in their family formation phase. And so work-life balance, making sure teachers have the ability to also raise their own children is an important motivating factor for teachers, and one that certainly, is important in the realm of labor as well. Occupational safety and health, especially the protection from violence and harassment, has unfortunately become an important issue lately. Just yesterday in my home country, the United States, again, 2 teachers were shot brutally in a school by what appears to be another deranged student with a weapon. And unfortunately, teachers world over face violence and harassment, not only from students, but from parents and from the community. It is a profession that is recognized as being particularly prone to violence. The ILO has a number of years ago adopted an important international labor convention in this regard, the Convention 190 on the prevention of violence and harassment. And the that's certainly become a new area for us to work on. And finally, social protection. And by this, I mean sorry, I'm getting a phone call, which I need to turn off. And social protection, by that, I mean Social Security and retirement pension and so forth and so on. So let me maybe just wrap up on the question of social dialogue. Social dialogue for the ILO is the importance of bringing in the social partners to discuss policy matters. It's important tenet of the ILO to make sure that teachers are involved in all matters dealing with education policy. That can include, and I'll get to this, negotiation, as I said, collective bargaining on things like salaries, on things that affect directly the teacher, but it can also extend to wider education policy. And we've seen, for example, a number of countries set up social dialogue institutions to deal with issues like occupational safety and health, education policy in general, and things like curriculum development and the use of technology in education. These are the 2 important ILO conventions that underpin social dialogue. So I just want to mention those. They are the ones that fundamentally give the rights to teachers to this. I have to point out that India, to this point, has not ratified these 2 conventions. So that is something that future teachers can perhaps urge the government to look into. It would certainly go a long way to securing the right of freedom of association for teacher unions in India. A few examples of the countries that have set up social dialogue institutions in education. So to point out that these kinds of dialogues are possible. Finally, this is the very end, maybe just some next steps. What's going to happen next coming out of these recommendations? There was a recommendation to establish national teacher commissions to address specifically teacher shortages. I think this is something that's going to be relevant to especially countries in Southern Africa, where there are really critical teacher shortages. Setting up national commissions to deal with this would be very important. National teacher policies. Very few countries actually have national teacher policies, and I'm sorry, I don't know if India has one, but we have worked with UNESCO to help countries establish national teacher policies. These are good means of establishing social dialogue in countries around teachers and getting countries to think about what they have to do to ensure the right number of teachers and a high quality of teachers that they can retain and motivate throughout their career. There was a call for the establishment of a fund for teacher salaries in crisis. This is a bit of an ambitious ask, but it's one that I think is very critical. You can imagine in some countries affected by crisis, teachers are not paid and might not be paid for months at a time. Those kinds of situations destroy an entire teaching force and can do so for a number of years, essentially condemning various cohorts of learners to subpar learning. So the idea of establishing a financing mechanism for teacher salaries in crisis situations has come up. It's one that we are looking into with existing financing mechanisms for education, but so far is not has not come very far, and I'll have to report back on that at some further point. And finally, there has been the proposal to revise the 66 and 97 recommendations, taking into consideration many of the new developments that have occurred in the last few years on education and some of the developments that I've outlined at the beginning of this presentation. This is a proposal that's now before ILO and UNESCO. Decisions will have to be made by our governance. And I'd be very curious in the discussion that we're going to have afterwards about some of your ideas, what could go into any new international instrument on teachers that would make a difference for the teaching profession. Thanks a lot. I'll stop there, and I look forward to a further discussion.
Thank you so much, Oliver. That was a wonderful presentation. And, in much of the analysis that you have shared, once had a deja vu feeling that, this is true for us too. And so, for instance, I think what the conditions of teachers, the issue of salaries, the issue of timely payment of salaries. The other very important point, which I think resonates with all of us, is how do you prepare teachers to teach? Not only keeping up with all the changes that are coming, but to be good professionals. So we need a very good induction course. And I think where this program is being held today is one of the premier institutions which constantly engages with how can we make the teacher preparation better and better and better. And then, of course, there's this whole issue of what we call in-service support. But you have alluded to it in a way that is also, so important for our context also, where her role is expanded, as you've rightly said, and her the support systems which are required for her have to be geared, engineered to support her, which is not just the local community, but parents, but also, as you've rightly listed in the analysis, the supportive educational institutions, the institutions where research and formulation of policy can directly help the teacher to deal with her work, and her mentorship, as you rightly said, and the collaboration and the partnerships which can help to promote her functioning in a better manner. And I think these are issues which are not only very relevant for our context, but also happily, there is a lot of engagement with this. And we may not be very much there, but, our government teachers get some of the best salaries anywhere in the world. I can't say this for our private sector in many places, but at least in the public government sector, they are one of the best paid, employees of the government. The second, I think, is that we have very active teacher unions, and you have alluded to that. So I really can't understand that last slide where they refused to sign off on some of those, norms, because we have very active unions. And I remember in my days in the state of Uttar Pradesh, where we were introducing new textbooks, I don't think I could have moved without the teachers not only being part of the entire construction of those books and the and the usability of those books. But the unions backed us through and through. And sometimes when we had trouble with some of the politics of the state, it was the unions who saw us through. But as you rightly said, you have to engage with them, you have to work with them, and they can be very constructive, not just in the matter of teacher working conditions, but also in the actual classroom, the actual content of teaching, and so on. So I think that's one area which constantly needs work and revision. What excited us a lot on this presentation of yours was also that, we are not alone in this world grappling with these problems. These seem to be universal. So in certain sense, it gives you courage to keep on working. But it also brings to you that how difficult this area is to work with, and how many challenges still remain unmet, even in our context, or maybe the developing world. So there is a pressure on our system. There is a pressure to change. There is a pressure not only to get to the new pedagogies and the IT world and so on, but also the pressure, as was said about performance, and the Indian parent still has a lot of hope and faith that the child and that teacher will help the child not only to learn, but to excel and also be able to get good placements, whether it's for higher education, which will ultimately impact their jobs and their work in the workplace. So there is a lot of pressure in our system. We are a high pressure system. And a lot of work still remains to be done on make helping not only the student cope with it, but also in guiding teachers to be able to uh, negotiate this space, the pace of change, the pace of um, uh, increasing content, and these many ancillary things that you mentioned, which are entering the classroom now. But having said all that, I think the recommendations are universal, and they hold good for even our context. And that is where I think a lot of application of mine within the country is going on, has always been there, but it is, I think, intensified now. We have a new education policy which came out in 2020, which gives a lot of attention, amongst other things, towards teacher preparation, towards teacher support. And I'm sure that you know when we hear people like you, we feel that there is a world working towards those same goals, and we don't feel so isolated, and we feel actually encouraged to be able to make a difference. And that a global perspective or a international perspective adds value for us to be able to negotiate some of the challenges which we think are very unique to us, but we learn a lot from persons like you who share what UN systems are considering, what some of the changes that are being shepherded and highlighted. So thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and a very energizing one, and a very hopeful one, which is so important in the sector of education. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I
Now
will open up for taking questions. I will first give priority to those who are in the audience physically. So will somebody help us to move to the first person who wants to question?
Yes, we'll do that.
And I'll request Oliver to take the 3 questions, and maybe then you can answer them.
Thank you for the lovely presentation. My name is Bindu and I'm a faculty here at CETE. I was just wondering when you said we need to, I think you and Vrinda mentioned about the high pressure system we have. And when we talk about not having education just for academic success, but a more holistic education, but we also see as a result, we have a shadow education system or a parallel system that runs this. What are your thoughts on this? Was this something discussed and experienced in other countries as well?
Can we take the next question, please? Is there a difficulty with the mic or something?
No,
Oliver,
no.
would you like to go ahead?
Yeah. So my question is that how do we know that about the conduct of the worldwide research like this, which gives us information about from the different regions and the countries of the in various parameters. So I want to know the kind of how you conducted and to know that the different regions and countries about it. Matlab actually that you mentioned no? That the worldwide research. So I want to know that what kind of parameter you used actually. Yeah.
Hello.
One more, please.
Yeah. Myself,
Yeah.
Ashish. I'm MA Development Studies first year student. So, ma'am, my question was, as sir also mentioned, there are some universal issues like he mentioned about global citizenship, health, community building, well-being, and issues of social justice and climate change also, which are emerging and which need to be taught, which need to be, these values need to be inculcated into the students. But sometimes it's often observed that in observation that teachers are also not well versed with these issues. So why not to make open digital sources? Because he also mentioned that there is misinformation in online platforms and internet. So why not ILO or international organizations intervene and make authentic resources on these issues, which can be available, freely available and accessible to teachers as well as
All right.
teachers.
Thank you. Thank you. We get your question. Oliver, over to you, please. Can you hear us, Oliver?
Apologies, it's my, I didn't touch the right button. Yes, I did. Excellent questions. Thank you. On shadow education, that's a very good question. Yes, it was mentioned. I mean, this is, I think, not only an India phenomenon. We see it in some Asian countries as well. Korea is well known for having basically school and then the second school that kids have to go to, where they basically relearn everything that was taught in school by a tutor. In the United States, all the coaching programs for getting into universities and passing standardized exams, all of it, which is highly privatized, is another example, basically, of a shadow education system, and that really speaks to the growing inequality in education by people in high stakes systems, where people who have the means can afford the bespoke training to pass high stakes exams. No, it is a critical issue, and certainly the question of equality in education was one that was addressed. I think it's also addressed in some of the work that's gone on higher education, to make sure that higher education institutions don't become simply institutions that reproduce the cultural elite of the country, right? It's there to build everyone, and how to make those institutions more equality driven and inclusive, I think is a real challenge. So yes, these are issues that were definitely mentioned. On the issue of private education, let me just say this. There was a strong emphasis on the issue that education is a public good and that it essentially should come from public funding. Now, there weren't many disputes in the panel, but I can say that on this issue, certainly the private sector representatives there was some discussion and negotiation on this issue because there is, clearly the perception that education is a huge market. It's a massive market for education technology, and it's a massive market for precisely this kind of shadow privatized education system that you can build up by stoking the anxious fears of ambitious parents and students. And that's something that needs to be addressed. And I think the panel is the first international body to recognize this and to at least address it as an issue. It hasn't come up with all the solutions yet, but it's pointed out that this is a problem and that one way to, address this is also to make sure that we don't focus only on high stakes education systems and cultures, but see education as a humanistic and holistic goal. Excuse me for a second. Apologies for that. On the research, that's an excellent question. And I have to admit that international bodies are a little bit spoiled because we can do two things. We can draw on research that's already been done by other international bodies. So we assume that that has gone through some sort of rigorous research methodology. As a practitioner, I have to say often that is based on desk reviews of national literature, and I can already hear some of the objections to that because a lot of the literature, for example, is produced in the English, in the Anglophone world. A lot of it focuses, I won't say just on developed countries, but on certain key countries where a lot of the research is generated. So there are obviously gaps in the information that we are receiving. However, the international institutions can also hold a lot of stakeholder consultations. So to inform our work on teachers, we did hold a number of regional consultations and global consultations where pretty much everyone was invited to participate. We had representatives of teacher unions, of employers, of governments, but also everyday teachers coming in online, sharing their experiences, sharing their knowledge. And these things were captured through the secretariats of UNESCO and ILO and were fed into the report of the high-level panel. And then, of course, the high-level panel itself was very diverse in its composition, bringing in representatives from many sectors and areas. So that's a little bit of how we approached that issue. And then through UNESCO and ILO, we of course also have statistical data that came into play. And then finally, I mean, this idea of open digital resources on some of these key issues like climate change, on mental well-being, I think they're excellent. It's an idea to take further. Some of this material exists, but at the end of the day, a lot of it has to be translated also into national contexts. What the sort of global community can produce is not necessarily always relevant or particularly gripping for a national context. So there is still work to be done to translate it to local level. Over to you.
Thank you very much. We'll move to the chat box. And can the Secretariat help us with if there are any questions there to just bring them out?
We have two questions. First is
Yeah.
from Jenny Reddy. Working conditions or status of teachers who are working in different stages of education ladder are so different. So how can this be addressed to maintain balance, in quality education across the academic ecosystem is the first question. Second is from Lokesh Rao. We are moving towards performance-based pay or outcomes-driven workforce, looking at global south and lower income countries. are put under a burden. How are we looking holistic education with challenges to teacher labor force versus econometric thought process? Then one more question we have, third question from Professor Maitli. What is ILO's position on teachers' assessment and performance-based career growth prospects, especially when these measures tend to be narrowly conceived to keep assessments costs manageable?
Over to you, Oliver.
Yes,
Some
thank you.
good questions.
I love all those questions. So on the first one on different conditions of teachers across the spectrum of education, let me say this. I mean, obviously, if there's a career progression ladder, that's excellent. That means that there is a clear pathway teachers can follow. Yes, it makes sense that a young startup teacher earns less than a highly experienced teacher, or that a teacher in a um, perhaps in a certain lower education category might not make as much as an experienced teacher in, say, a highly specialized technical area. However, there are other disparities which need to be addressed. One is, of course, in early childhood education. I think it's becoming increasingly recognized that early childhood education is a profession on par at the same level as primary education. It requires a lot of training, and it requires a lot of skills that are very specialized. A lot of the professional aspects require for example, health and psychological and pedagogical training that is very specialized. So certainly the recommendations from the UN system are that this is at least paid on par with teachers in the primary system. Gender is another issue. It's well known that there's an important need for more women in the so-called STEM topics: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These sometimes can be paid better. There is still a predominance of men teachers, for example, in secondary education, which tends to be paid better. So these gender inequalities, I think, are critical to address. It's key to bring more men into, for example, early childhood education, where I think over 90% of the workforce is women, and it's equally important to bring more women into the secondary teaching professions and tertiary, especially in the STEM topics. And I think that would be one way to really equalize salaries and pay in these areas. The other two questions I think are related, and they are really something very key. Education now is being seen under the management light of output-based performance. What kind of metrics can we put on teachers? And from another, to take an analogy from another area I work in health, it's a bit like saying doctors should be assessed on how well the patient does. The result will very simply be that all doctors will migrate to well-funded hospitals where they're treating minor injuries and skin conditions, rather than emergency room in poor areas where people are facing potentially critical diseases or accidents. It's the same thing in education. If it's precisely more investment is going to be needed in systems where learners are not performing, where learners are failing. That's where the most of the work is going to be done. And if you start measuring teachers on what their performance is there based on universal metrics, that's not going to have a very happy outcome. So the international system very much has moved toward assessment that focuses on formative assessment. In other words, assessment that feeds back into the system as a way of improving the system, as a way of improving the teacher, recognizing that metrics have to be understood within the context of learning, that supervision should unfortunately not just be done algorithmically by test scores and things like that, but should be ideally carried out by supervisors or by a committee of peers to assess how a teacher is performing in situ in the classroom. These are the ways to really develop the profession and strengthen education. And certainly merit-based systems, for example, are highly discouraged. Even by the 1966 recommendation, already recognized that merit-based systems and kind of metric-based systems to evaluate teachers were not the way forward.
Thank you. I think that provides a lot of clarity. I think these were all excellent questions from the audience and very well answered with a comparative picture. Again, as I said, people like you, when they speak here in our kind of institutions, I think you bring a wonderful perspective. So thank you so much. And I will hand it back to Dr. Richa to close the proceedings.
Thank you, Madam Swaroop. And I would like to thank Dr. Liang for taking us through the pertinent recommendations of the High Panel Committee. And as you, Madam, succinctly, described all those recommendations, that they are universal in their appeal and yet locally quite pertinent and significant. And takeaway from some of these are that the recommendations with respect to the decent work, they both, sort of sound ironical. At the same time, seems that we have people and comrades in our company across the globe. And yeah, for me particularly, I think coming from ILO, the idea that education is a public good is something that we need to mull over more, and as teachers should think more about it. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, both of you, for taking your time out. Dr. Liang, especially from different time zones, but also that here also it's raining. So, in some way, nature is also aligned. And thank you, audience. I would like to invite you tomorrow, which is the final talk of the series. And we will have our very own Dr. Padma Sarangapani, who will be speaking about the CETE report, which will take us through the status of the teacher in the context, which is our very own. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.